know how we're going to get across that at this stage. There's also been a really different approach between the sanctions issued in probation and in parole, particularly around dilute samples. So in a probation situation, the court says, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, whereas in the parole situation, the parole board's saying, if it's dilute, you're going to jail unless you can prove it wasn't deliberately dilute, and that is a minefield. It is hot, so pathology has told us as little as 500 mils of water can dilute your urine, so it's a real challenge to be navigating that. We've trialled a couple of things, and we're about to bring in some training, I think it's probably today, for some saliva tests. Very small window, but it is accredited, so we could potentially get away from some of that need to send things to Perth. We trialled a swab test, literally swabbing people for sweat and looking, because that's supposed to have a really good window that correlates with urine. Unfortunately, it didn't work. It was great. We had the whole setup. We had a urine service, a bus set outside. We had all the offenders come in. You'd see it said Drug Detection Agency along the side, and they were all talking, and everyone was on their phones. And so it was exciting, but it didn't quite get us what we needed. And treatment services, really quickly just to touch on this, we got a ton of money, and we're just about to allocate more than 20 rehab beds and a whole bunch of services, specific an after-hours program and some dedicated counselling, psychologist services and social work services to provide what is needed there. I read something the other day that says the NT already has the highest proportion of drug and alcohol beds, and it's absolutely not enough. So I really feel for the rest of you trying to use an even more infrequent service. I can't tell you who they are because we haven't told them yet, but it's all been approved, and that's going to be on board really, really soon. And the last big challenge for us is that those two the yellow stars represent our two prisons that are 20 hours apart, 1,600 kilometres away, and that's the only two places we can lock people up. That is not the only two places that people live. We have two work camps, but they're an open security, low custody kind of idea, and they're not equipped to take people in, particularly people who might come in under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Police are stationed out in remote areas, but they've only got 1 or 2 people on as well, and they can't hold people overnight. It is a real challenge for us. It's not a new challenge to deal with remote, and all I can say is we're working on it. And I don't know what the answer is going to be at this stage. I don't think anyone expects us to solve all of the problems, but I think we are getting creative on this. We've tried to do things like, well, if the police station's open for 6 hours, can you do 2 one-day stays in jail, 6 hours a pop? They can go home at night, and you can just book in the next day. There's nothing to say that's not possible. Haven't got that one across the line yet, but at least our parole officers are being really creative in trying to make that sort of thing work. Video links coming into court. Yeah, so that's our major challenge that we're facing at the moment. That's going to be the hardest one, but we'll see if I can make it work. So really, I think just to leave you with that not fitting on the page, make mistakes, learn from them, and move on is really the key principle from that program. So, sorry for talking too long.
Thanks very much for that, Laura. Any questions for Laura? One down there.
So I was just wondering if you had any ideas of what a sanction that's alternative to incarceration might look like without over-servicing the person?
At this stage, we haven't really done much investigation out of that. The program that we looked at was considering whether or not some kind of go to an outstation or go and spend some time with elders or doing a particular cultural related activity might be of benefit. Trying to still get there to be some consequence, some immediate removal, because it's not about that punishment, it's about disrupting someone's life and doing something different. So there's potential for that, but we're really a bit in the infancy with that at the moment. And we're also really stuck legislatively for what we can do to do something different. Probably our best opportunity in that space is kind of to expand the idea of what custody is and start to bring in some options that would fit more broadly with that rather than a complete different Because that would, in our current system, that would involve varying an order. We couldn't do things like send someone to community work or anything like that. So, a little bit stuck.
Just a question. So if the person is saying, oh, I can't get rid of my kids until Friday, doesn't that remove the uncomfortableness of going back into custody?
Yeah, it can do. It's not something that they would be given the opportunity to do all the time. We found it really interesting, some of the programs we looked at, someone could have work release, so they would literally book into jail every night. This, I guess, was designed, and in the instances that we've seen it happen, is to try and still give someone credit for taking that responsibility of showing up to court and saying, I made a mistake, I'm going to keep trying, keep me on the order, but don't rip the rug out from underneath me at this stage. Give me the chance to deal with some of my immediate responsibilities, because it's not about ripping the rug out from under people. The short sanction is designed really to not be too interruptive in someone's life. So you might be able to miss a day of work, you're not going to lose your job, you're not going to lose your house, all those sorts of things. So it's not something that you would see someone get necessarily over and over. So we can't do that legislatively in terms of, no, that's not an option under our legislation. I think also our courts don't really think that that's an alternative. They probably think that's just kind of a bit of a break to do the same thing. So, I mean, we've got to work with that, so, yeah. Anyone else?
In your introduction, you indicated that the Northern Territory has 5 times the national average for incarceration, and that was probably one of the underpinning reasons why you were exploring alternatives and underpinned the introduction of the commit, or certainly contributed toward it. It's been, commit's been in place now since June 2016, I think you said. Yep. Have you done any research into whether there has been a reduction as a consequence?
No, we haven't looked at stats on that at the moment. So we've had 87 people sentenced to commit, and that's over time. And so where all of those people are at is a whole raft of things. Some people have come out the other end and they've completed an order successfully. Some people have been revoked for reoffending or conditional issues. Some people have struggled and the courts ultimately decided, you know what, this program's just not right for you, and just taken them out. Some people are out in the community doing well. Some people are bouncing in and out of custody and sanctions. There's 3 or 4 who've run away, and quite a huge proportion of those people haven't even started on the program yet. So they're on partially suspended sentences. They've got to serve, some of them have got to serve 18 months before they even come out. So it's too small for us to go and to know at this stage. We know we're seeing lots and lots of breaches, lots of things bouncing in and out of court. But that's okay, because lots of people are continuing on, and we're starting to get that engagement. Parole, we've only just started, and there's only 20 people have even come out, so not at this stage.
Thanks very much for that, Laura.
Laura, on behalf of the COA and all the conference attendees, thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon.
Thank you.
And a small token.
Thank you.
We're just about to get underway with the next presentation. I have to say that today I've been interested in all of the presentations we've had, but I have a particular bias for this topic. given my work in the sex offender treatment program area in WA. At lunchtime, I was fortunate enough to have a brief chat to our next presenter, and I'm no longer simply interested, I'm really excited. I'm really looking forward to this one. Our next presenter is Dr. Danielle Arlanda Harris. She's a lecturer in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University. She's a member of the Griffith Criminology Institute and holds a doctorate in criminology from Griffith University and a master's in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Maryland. For full details of Dr. Danielle Arlanda Harris's qualifications, please refer to your conference booklet. She has recently returned to Australia after 15 years in the United States, where she received grants from the Guggenheim Foundation and the California Sex Offending Management Board. She's published over 30 articles and book chapters and has presented at over 50 international conferences. She's recently released her first book, Desistance from Sexual Offending, Narratives of Retirement, Regulation and Recovery. Her presentation today explores the strategies that men who have been convicted of sexual offences use to pursue, achieve and maintain offence-free lives upon release from prison. After her presentation, there will be time for questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Danielle Arlanda Harris.
Hi everybody, thank you so much. That all looks too important to put water near it, so I'll put it here. Okay. All right, and there's a clicky, flicky stick thing. Fabulous. Okay, hi. As indicated, I am indeed Danielle Harris, and I'm really excited to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. So I have, from ever since my very first presentation at the American Society of Criminology conference in 2003, when my session was at 8 a.m. on the Saturday morning, and I was in a session with some dude who was presenting a project about cannibals, which BT dubs included photographs of people eating other people's feet. I have felt the need to start every presentation with, okay, now it's time to switch gears a bit, or, presented at criminology conferences about sexual offending and felt like a fish out of water, or presented at psychology offense conferences about something that was a criminological thing and felt like a fish out of water. But I am so pleasantly excited by the fact that what I'm going to talk about today flows so perfectly on from the other presentations that we've seen today. I've been furiously taking notes. I thoroughly enjoyed Laura's point about how we're dealing with people and the idea that we need to not think about what they've done, but think about what they did next. I also really liked Shandon's comments about when they leave, where do they fit in? I'll demonstrate to you that for men convicted of sexual offences and incarcerated in the US at least, under current legislation, there are not a lot of places for them to go when they get released, so there are not a lot of places for them to fit. And that should absolutely be our goal, I think. I'm also relieved to be presenting to a whole lot of parole and probation officers and not be looking at a sea of uniforms with lots of guns. Either you're keeping them concealed, and that's fine, or it's just so nice to be home. So I would also just like to thank you all and honour the work, the incredibly difficult and demanding work that you all do. I quite enjoy doing my research from the ivory tower and stepping down every now and then to interact with the people that consume this research. So I just want to also thank you for the work that you do. So how can we link a presentation on gangs and violent extremists and a small geographically remote community in Northern Territory with a group of people who have committed fairly serious sexual offences? I think the thing that's really stuck out for me today is that we're talking about people, we're dealing with people, and at the most basic level, we're talking about human beings following what is largely a natural human process, and that there's more that unites us than divides us. and there's so much that we can learn from looking at each other in specific sort of subfields. It's complicated and it's complex, but we're all in this together. So I'd like to start by having everyone hold hands so we can sing Kumbaya. I'm just kidding. Okay, so, but seriously, here we go. So I'm going to define and attempt to deconstruct desistance. I have heard it mentioned a couple of times today, so hopefully you already know what I'm talking about. I've argued that it's the other side of the recidivism coin, and I'll explain why that's rubbish now. And I'll talk about what we know so far, give a very brief history lesson, maybe a little bit of theory. I promise it will be brief. Go over the methods of what I did and how I did it and why and under what circumstances, and then what the results showed, and then the discussion and conclusions, and most excitingly, I think, the next steps. I'm absolutely happy to send these slides to you if you wish. My email address is at the end, so for those of you that are taking photos, if you'd like the full version, I'm happy to pass that along. So desistance is a key component of the criminal career paradigm, this way of understanding life course criminology or crime and criminality across the life course, and it's been a staple of criminological thought for over 200 years. For general traditional criminology, we have known that crime is typically a young man's game, that you tend to age out of it for various reasons. You might be familiar with the age crime curve, where the majority of offences are committed in adolescence or early adulthood, and that for various reasons people tend to stop committing those crimes as they age out. There's also a small percentage, around 5% according to which person you read, with these the group referred to as life course persisters, who are a little bit different, and they're the ones that probably they're the ones that make the news. They're the ones that are in the high risk, high needs groups. They're the pointy end. There's not very many of them, but for some, because they've made the news, they're the ones that a raft of legislation has been written for, at least in the United States. So this process of desistance, this process of slowing down and stopping offending and maintaining an offence-free life, is a natural process that's been observed across time and across space in other countries, in other jurisdictions, for different kinds of offences. We know that there's a little bit of a difference with sex offending because there are certain types of sex offences that aren't possible to commit unless you're a certain age, for example. Like if you're offending against a child and you need to have a certain number of years. I mean, you don't need. I mean, to be able to make a charge, there has to be a certain number of years between you and the person, whatever. So there are some things like incest, for example, is only possible if you have a family, etc. So there are certain things that require a different age crime curve for sexual offending, but generally speaking, the trajectory of offending in youth and aging out as you get older for the majority of people is pretty standard. It's an empirical reality even among individuals that have been convicted of sexual offences. We know, for example, that there is a fairly small recidivism rate for sex offending, but instead of talking about we talk about this small recidivism rate rather than describing this fairly large success rate. And I think that we could just do better by being more positive. So while all of that is the case, an industry has grown to emphasise risk and containment. And I use the word industry very deliberately because especially in the US, people are making a lot of money in this space. From risk assessment tools, individualised programs, penile plethysmography, which as far as I know, is not yet used in Australia. You don't do the little mercury band around the penis and make them watch porn and see how that, yeah, because you think that's a bit odd? Yeah, well, that's required in a lot of states in the US. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, it's not a thing here? Great. We could just talk about penile plethysmography if you'd like all day. Anyway, that's great. I'm glad that we don't do that here. We're better than that. So there are things like this, you know, there's the static 99 risk assessment tool, which distills a dynamic individual to a number out of 12, and then that number follows them for the rest of time. We've talked about, I think it was Jared this morning that talked about the heaviness, the weight of a patch on a person's jacket. And then Shandon talked about the heaviness and the weight of a neck tattoo, right? The heaviness and the weight of the sex offender label or of a static risk assessment score of 9 that was calculated when you were 32 and released from custody, but now you're 72 and trying to live in the community is just as heavy, if not worse. And of course now in the US with the Sex Offender Public Registry, you're on the internet forever. We are, unfortunately, we're about close to reaching the unfortunate milestone of having 1 million, that's 6 zeros, 1 million Americans on the publicly available sex offender registry. That's not useful. So anyway, I wasn't going to ramble too much at the beginning. I was going to leave that till later. So there's this industry that's grown to deal with the problem of sex offending, and it is a serious issue, of course. And I don't mean to dismiss that, but there's the assumption of recidivism has led to us focusing on and assuming escalation and specialization. Right? Once a sex offender, always a sex offender. If he's done it once, he'll do it again. Blah blah blah. And while that exists and while those people make news, it happens and it's horrible and it makes news. It makes news because it happens so rarely and it's horrible when it happens, and I understand that it's very difficult for people to grasp, but these things happen incredibly rarely, and then writing legislation with those very specific circumstances in mind and then applying them to anybody who has a penis or anybody who has peed on the sidewalk or, as in Georgia, anybody who has breastfed in public and the cop's in a bad mood and now you're on the sex offender registry for life because of indecent exposure. I'm not kidding, you can't make this up. Okay, so the impact of current public policy, especially in the US, on stigma and labelling really doesn't do very much to acknowledge the very real process of desistance. So in my research, I had previously described desistance as the positive side of the recidivism coin. I had interviewed a whole lot of people. By the way, 74 is too big for qualitative analysis. Just if anyone's thinking of doing a qualitative study, just stick to 20 like everybody else does. But I wanted to go big, so I interviewed 74 people. And most of them had, they had all committed a crime, a sexual crime, been referred for civil commitment, which is continuing detention or an indefinite sentence, beyond the sentence that they were given for the offence, right? So they've committed the crime, they've served the time, they get up to the end of the serving the time, and 2 independent psychiatrists say, you're still at risk, so we're going to put you back in prison for a bit more, and then you end up in a treatment facility where there is no such thing as treatment back in the 60s when this facility started. And then you are kept until you are cured and you are released. So I met with 74 men who had been subjected to that legislation and been released at some point between 1991 and 2011. And 16 of those men were back, 11 of those men were back in custody. So I thought that I had these 2 really neat groups. Desisters were the ones that I interviewed in the community, and recidivists were the ones that I interviewed in custody. And I thought it was really clear, right? The recidivists I sat on a chair like this to talk to, and the desisters I sat on at a table like this to talk to them. And it turns out that it's not that simple, right? So when I started writing the chapter on recidivism, I realized that a lot of the men that I interviewed in the community had long histories of going in and out of custody for years and years and years because they had been, engaged in quite a lot of offences. There were also people that I interviewed in custody who